At 8:17 a.m. on November 2, 1944, Germany, Lieutenant David Deadeye Miller realized he was about to die. His Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a beast of an aircraft nicknamed the Jug, was vibrating violently, not from enemy fire, but from the silence. His .850 caliber Browning machine guns, the fearsome chorus that had defined his existence for the past 6 months, had clicked empty. The last of his 3,400 rounds was gone. Below him, a continent of flak and fury. In front of him, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, its nose painted a mocking yellow, was banking hard to deliver the killing blow. This was the moment every pilot dreaded. It was the fatal flaw. The P-47 was sold to pilots on a promise of sheer unadulterated resilience. It was a flying battleship built around the most powerful piston engine in the sky, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. It could absorb punishment that would shred a Spitfire or a Mustang into confetti and still bring its pilot home. But the engineers and the tacticians at Fort Knox and Wright Field had overlooked a simple, brutal truth of aerial combat. A fortress is useless if it has no ammunition. The Jug's 8 guns gave it a devastating punch, but the rate of fire meant a pilot could exhaust his entire combat load in under 30 seconds of continuous firing. The official doctrine preached trigger discipline, short and controlled bursts. But doctrine is written in quiet rooms with chalkboards, not in a sky filled with cannon shells and closing velocities of 600 miles per hour.
The result was a recurring nightmare for the fighter groups of the 8th Air Force. Pilots were becoming undertakers, escorting bombers to their targets and then finding themselves utterly defenseless for the long, agonizing flight home. The Germans knew this. Their pilots had learned to wait, to harry the Thunderbolts, to make them burn through their ammo in frantic bursts of self-defense. Then, like wolves isolating a weakened bison, they would close in for the kill. The radios would crackle with the same hopeless refrains, "Bandit on my 6, I'm dry," followed by a final terrible silence. The squadron's mechanics saw the evidence every day. Perfectly good P-47s, their engines still running strong, would return to base looking like Swiss cheese, their pilots grim-faced and shaken. Worse were the ones that didn't return at all. The despair in the 56th Fighter Group was a tangible thing, a cold dread that clung to the Nissen huts and the ready rooms. They were flying the toughest planes in the world, yet they were dying because of a flaw that seemed on the surface impossible to fix. You couldn't just add more bullets. The weight and balance of the aircraft were sacred. The system had given them a sword that was incredibly sharp, but it shattered after the first few swings, and the system had no other answer. This is where the legend of the unsung genius begins. His name was Technical Sergeant Frank Grabowski, a 28-year-old crew chief from Milwaukee. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't an engineer with a degree from Caltech. He was a mechanic whose world was the smell of hydraulic fluid, the satisfying torque of a wrench on a bolt, and the intricate, greasy anatomy of the Double Wasp engine. Grabowski was grounded, not by choice, but by a case of severe tinnitus from a flak burst a year earlier that had ruptured his left eardrum. He couldn't fly, so he poured all his energy into the machines that did. This small, mundane injury gave him a unique perspective. While the pilots saw the battle from 20,000 feet, Grabowski saw it in the aftermath, in the ripped metal, the shattered canopies, and the grim tally of holes he had to patch. He felt every loss personally, as a failure of the machine he was tasked to maintain. He saw the fatal flaw not as a tactical problem, but as a mechanical one. He was obsessed with the P-47's almost mythical durability. He'd seen them come back with entire cylinders shot off, with wings that looked like they'd been chewed by a giant, with tails half severed. The plane just refused to die. It was this refusal that sparked the idea.
The eureka moment didn't come in a flash of lightning. It was a slow burn, born of weeks of frustration. It happened late one night in a dimly lit hangar. Grabowski was staring at the wreck of a P-47 that had, miraculously, belly-landed after its pilot bailed out. The plane was a write-off, but its poor structure was intact. He ran his hand over the leading edge of the wing, a thick, heavy curve of stressed aluminum designed to cut through the air at over 400 miles per hour. He saw a deep, crushing indentation in it, where it had clearly struck something. Yet the main spar, the bone of the wing, was bent but unbroken. He thought of the engine, a 2-ton behemoth of forged steel sitting right at the front. He looked at the massive paddle blade propeller. It was, in essence, a nearly indestructible battering ram with wings. The thought that surfaced was so profoundly stupid, so completely against every regulation ever written, that he almost laughed it off. What if, when the guns ran dry, the plane itself was the final bullet? What if you didn't just fly the fortress? What if you threw it at the enemy? It was a suicidal tactic on paper, but Grabowski, looking at the sheer mass of the wreckage before him, knew the truth. The price of the current failure was already death. This was, at least, a fighting chance. The secret was too insane to propose officially. A report on the matter would have earned him a psychiatric evaluation. So it started as a whisper, a late-night conversation over lukewarm coffee with a young, desperate pilot named Lieutenant Jimmy "Red" O'Neill. O'Neill was a friend. Grabowski was his crew chief. O'Neill had seen 2 wingmen die in the last month, both ammo dry. He was receptive to anything. "Look at this wing, Red," Grabowski said, pointing to a P-47 he was patching. "This thing can take a hit from a 20mm cannon and keep flying. What do you think happens if this hits the tail of a 109? It's like a Mack truck hitting a bicycle." He explained his theory. Not a head-on collision, that was suicide, but a glancing blow, a wingtip to the tail, a propeller chop to the fuselage, using the jug's raw mass as a melee weapon. It was the logic of a barroom brawl applied to aerial combat. It broke every rule. It was madness. But for a pilot who had felt the icy grip of helplessness at 20,000 feet, it sounded like hope. O'Neill didn't agree to it, not aloud. He just nodded slowly, a new, dangerous calculation in his eyes. The seed of the idea was planted in the only place it could grow, the desperate mind of a frontline combatant.
The first battle, the proof, came just 1 week later, November 9th, 1944. A massive bomber escort mission deep into Germany. The sky was a hornet's nest of contrails and cannon fire. Lieutenant O'Neill, flying his P-47 Milwaukee Mauler, had done his job well. He had downed 2 Focke-Wulf FW-190s that were preying on the B-17s. But on the long, treacherous journey home, he was jumped by a fresh squadron of Bf-109s. His wingman was hit and went down in flames. O'Neill fought like a cornered animal, his guns blazing. But the inevitable click, click, click of empty breeches finally came. Just as the manual predicted and just as Grabowski had described, a lone 109 slipped onto his tail, patient and professional. O'Neill could see the pilot's face in his rearview mirror. He was trapped. The official doctrine said to dive away, to use the P-47's superior speed to escape. But the German was good, staying with him, slowly closing the distance for the perfect, undeflected shot. It was the exact scenario that had killed his friends. Despair washed over him. Then he heard Grabowski's voice in his head. It's a Mack truck hitting a bicycle. He made a decision. It was not a decision born of courage, but of pure, unadulterated rage. He was not going to die a victim. He broke every rule they had ever taught him. Instead of diving, he chopped his throttle and threw his heavy plane into a skidding, unnatural turn. The maneuver was so unexpected that the German pilot, who was lining up his shot, overshot him, flying past in a gray blur. Now O'Neill was on his 6, but with empty guns. The German ace, realizing his mistake, began to climb, intending to loop back around and finish the job. This was the moment. O'Neill pushed his throttle to the firewall. The double Wasp engine roared, not with the promise of a kill, but as the engine of a projectile. He wasn't aiming his gun sight. He was aiming the entire 2-ton mass of his propeller and engine block. He closed the distance with terrifying speed. The German pilot glanced back, his eyes widening in disbelief. No one was foolish enough to ram an enemy. It was a mutually assured destruction that violated the very instinct of survival. But O'Neill was past survival.
He was thinking of his fallen wingman. He was thinking of the mechanics who would have to patch his plane, or worse, pack up his belongings. He was thinking of Frank Grabowski.
The physical sensation was jarring, a violent shudder that felt like the teeth of God grinding together. O'Neill didn't aim for the cockpit, he aimed for the tail. He slightly lowered his right wing and brought the leading edge, the very piece of metal Grabowski had pointed to, up into the BF-109's empennage. The sound was not a crash, but a deafening metallic scream. For a split second, the two planes were locked together. He saw the swastika on the tail fin fill his canopy. Then it simply disintegrated. The German fighter's tail assembly, rudder, stabilizers, and all was sheared clean off. The BF-109, now just a fuselage and wings, snapped violently out of control. It tumbled end over end like a discarded toy and began its final, silent plunge to the earth below. O'Neill's Thunderbolt was thrown into a vicious roll. His instrument panel shattered. The stick was wrenched from his hands. For a terrifying moment, he thought he had failed, that he had merely signed both of their death warrants. But then he wrestled the plane back under control. She was hurt, badly. The right wing was mangled, bent upwards at a grotesque angle. But she was flying. The engine never missed a beat. He had done it. Incredibly, it worked.
He nursed the battered Milwaukee Mauler for over an hour, a slow, painful journey back to friendly territory. When he finally landed at his base in England, he practically had to be lifted from the cockpit, shaking uncontrollably. The ground crews stared in stunned silence at the aircraft. The outer third of the right wing was a mangled ruin of twisted aluminum, the metal peeled back to reveal the raw, unbroken main spar. It looked like it had hit a mountain. His squadron commander, a by-the-book major named Thompson, sprinted onto the tarmac, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "What in God's name happened to your plane, Lieutenant?" he yelled over the idling engine. O'Neill, exhausted and still high on adrenaline, looked him straight in the eye. "I ran out of ammo, sir. My gun camera is empty, but my kill is confirmed. It's on my wing." Thompson stared at the wreckage, then at O'Neill, then back at the wreckage. He was about to start screaming about regulations, about the destruction of government property. But then he saw the look in the eyes of the other pilots and mechanics who were gathering around. It wasn't pity, it was awe. He had taken a hopeless situation and invented a victory. Thompson's shoulders slumped. He took a deep breath. "Get him to debriefing," he said quietly, "and not a word of this to anyone. Officially, you were hit by debris." He had become the patron of the secret.
The underground spread began that very night. The story, too good to be contained, moved through the base like an electrical current. It was told in hushed tones in the barracks, over clandestine bottles of whiskey. It wasn't an official tactic, it was a legend. Pilots would casually walk by O'Neill's battered P-47, which Grabowski had deliberately left outside the hangar, a silent monument to the impossible. They'd run their hands over the shredded wing, feeling the impossible reality of it. The conversation changed in the ready rooms. Before a mission, a pilot would clap his buddy on the shoulder and say, "And if you run dry, give 'em the O'Neill kiss." It was gallows humor, but it held a core of deadly seriousness. It was an option, a final desperate move in a game that had previously had none. A mechanic from another squadron came to see Grabowski, a wrench in his hand. "Heard about what your boy did," he said. "Show me where to reinforce the spars, just in case." This was the conspiracy of the front lines, a grassroots movement of men who were tired of dying by the book. They were quietly, unofficially, modifying their aircraft, adding a few rivets here, a small reinforcing plate there.
The evidence of the underground tactic began to surface, not in official reports, but in the perplexing statistics that landed on the desk of Colonel Cassius, the Fixer, Vance, the group's commanding officer. Vance was a pragmatist, a leader who cared about one thing and one thing only: results. His desk was littered with after-action reports, and he started noticing a disturbing and illogical pattern. Over the next month, 3 more P-47s had returned to base with severe, inexplicable impact damage to their wings or propellers, almost identical to O'Neill's. In all 3 cases, the pilots claimed to have been, quote, hit by debris, unquote, from an enemy aircraft they had just shot down. Yet their gun camera footage would run out moments before the supposed kill. Even more telling, the group's loss rate for pilots engaged in dogfights had dropped, just slightly, but measurably, by 18% to be exact. Fewer planes were being reported as lost in action after running out of ammunition. It didn't make sense. It was a statistical anomaly that defied conventional explanation. Vance knew his men weren't lying, but they were hiding something big. The system was being cheated, but it was being cheated in a way that produced victories. They were preparing to break the rules to survive.
The confrontation came when Colonel Vance personally inspected the latest P-47 to return with a debris scar. He ran his hand along the crumpled wing, a deep, V-shaped gouge that looked suspiciously like the shape of a BF-109's tail fin. He looked at the pilot, a young second lieutenant who could barely meet his gaze. Vance was no fool. He had flown in the First World War. He knew the feel of a plane and the look of a lie. He summoned Major Thompson, Lieutenant O'Neill, and on a hunch, the crew chief whose name kept being whispered in connection with these incidents, Technical Sergeant Frank Grabowski. The 4 of them stood in Vance's office, the air thick with unspoken tension. I have read 3 reports that tell me 3 of my pilots have the worst luck in the world but the best survival instincts, Vance began, his voice dangerously calm. They keep running into debris from planes they swear they shot down, yet their cameras always seem to run out of film. Now I want someone to tell me what's really going on. There was a long silence. Finally, O'Neill, emboldened by his survival, stepped forward. "Sir," he said, "we've found a new way to use the jug." O'Neill, with interjections from Grabowski, told him everything. They explained the fatal flaw, the desperation, the late-night theory, the first frantic battle, and the secret silent spread of the tactic. They called it the Thunderbolt Ram. Vance listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When they finished, he was silent for a full minute, tapping a pen on his desk. On one side was the Book of Regulations, a thick, suffocating volume that prescribed court-martials for the willful destruction of military property. On the other side were the results: dead German pilots and living American ones. He looked at Grabowski, the mechanic who had dared to think outside the engineering manuals. "You're telling me you encourage my pilots to use a 7-ton fighter plane as a battering ram?" he asked, his voice flat. "I'm telling you, sir," Grabowski replied, his voice steady, "that it's better than listening to them die on the radio because they're out of bullets. The plane can take it." Vance stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the airfield, at the rows of magnificent, flawed machines. He was a part of the system, a guardian of its rules, but he was also responsible for the lives of the men under his command.
His decision became the stuff of legend. He turned from the window. "This conversation never happened," he said, looking at each man in turn. "There is no Thunderbolt Ram tactic. There is, however, a new confidential directive for pilots of this group, effective immediately." He walked back to his desk and began to write. The order he issued was a masterpiece of bureaucratic subversion. It didn't mention ramming. It didn't sanction the tactic. Instead, it stated, "In a situation where all ordnance has been expended and the pilot is facing imminent threat, any and all evasive or aggressive maneuvering necessary to ensure survival and the destruction of the enemy is left to the pilot's discretion. No pilot who returns to base successfully under these circumstances will face disciplinary review for damage sustained to his aircraft." It was a green light wrapped in red tape. He finished it with a final handwritten addendum. "And anyone who punishes a soldier for bringing himself and his plane home will answer to me personally." The system had not been broken. It had been bent to the will of a genius mechanic and a few brave pilots. The triumph was sealed not in medals, but in numbers. With the unspoken threat of punishment lifted, the secret became an accepted last-ditch option. Over the final brutal months of the war, the kill-to-loss ratio of the group's P-47s in ammo-dry situations changed dramatically. The tactic was used sparingly, only in moments of extreme desperation, but its existence was enough. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Pilots flew with a newfound confidence, knowing they had one last, defiant move. The legend grew. A pilot from another group, forced to land at their base, saw a P-47 with a shredded wing and asked what had happened. A mechanic simply grinned and said, "He ran out of bullets, so he used the hammer." The phrase stuck. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just the jug. It was the war hammer. The irrefutable proof was in the maintenance logs. A dramatic increase in wing and propeller repairs, and a corresponding beautiful decrease in letters written to the families of men who weren't coming home.
And what of the hero of our story, Technical Sergeant Frank Grabowski? He received no Medal of Honor. His name was never mentioned in official dispatches. His reward was the quiet, profound satisfaction he felt every time a P-47, battered but whole, taxied back to his hangar with a pilot who, by all rights, should have been dead. He got a firm handshake from Colonel Vance and a bottle of contraband scotch from the pilot's mess. That was all. After the war, as the world celebrated the great generals and the famous aces, Grabowski returned to Milwaukee. He used his savings to open a small auto repair shop. For the next 40 years, he fixed Fords and Chevrolets. His hands, which had once re-engineered a weapon of war, now tuning carburetors and replacing brake pads. His neighbors knew him as Frank, the quiet mechanic who was good with engines. None of them knew that the simple, brilliant idea in his head had saved countless lives and helped win the war in the skies over Europe. He was the quintessential unsung hero, a man who made history and then quietly walked away from it. But the invention, his brilliantly simple idea, lived on. The legend of the Thunderbolt ram became an unwritten part of military aviation doctrine. It was a testament to the idea of total survivability, that the aircraft itself is a weapon of last resort. The story was told by grizzled veterans to green young pilots heading to Korea, and then again to a new generation flying Phantoms over Vietnam. The planes changed, from the P-47 to the F-86 Sabre to the F-4 Phantom, but the core principle remained: never give up. Never consider yourself unarmed. The spirit of Grabowski's desperate insight that the man and the machine are more resilient than the regulations that govern them became an eternal piece of combat wisdom. Officially, it didn't exist, but every pilot knew that when all else failed, they were still flying the hammer.
This is the moral of the legend. History is not forged in the grand halls of command or in sterile laboratories. It is hammered out in the mud, the grease, and the terror of the front lines. It is made by ordinary people, the mechanics, the privates, the junior lieutenants who see a fatal flaw in the system not as an obstacle, but as a problem to be solved. They are the ones who dared to break the rules not for glory or recognition, but to save the person next to them. The name of Frank Grabowski is not on any monument, but his legacy is written in the contrails of every pilot who made it home because someone, somewhere, had the courage to embrace a brilliantly stupid idea that, incredibly, worked. Wars are won by the unsung genius, the individual who, in a moment of crisis, proves that the human spirit is more powerful than any system designed to contain it.